All right. Without further ado, I'm going to hide myself. We're going to go away. We're going to let David take it over. And again, any questions, please use the Q&A function down below. All right, guys. Thank you. David, we're here in the background if you need us.
Okay. Jeff, are we good? And can everybody see my screen?
Looks
Yes,
good.
looking good.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. I'm David Riddle. I'm with the Falcon Group. So a quick introduction so you know who your presenter is today. I have been a mechanical engineer for many years, more than I care to think of. Have designed cooling tower replacements. I've actually been the contractor replacing them before. So this is a subject area that I know a fair amount about. And hopefully we get some information from today. Questions, inevitably, I've walked out of seminars and said, oh crap, I meant to ask that question. If that happens and something comes up, I believe as part of the presentation, I think the last slide has my email address, and certainly my contact information is available through ACE by TSK as well. So if something comes up afterwards, feel free to email me. I love answering questions and just help in general helping folks out. So, um, and then that way, when you need me, you'll need me, but definitely want to be there as a resource. So today we're going to be talking about understanding cooling towers and the fundamentals of cooling towers, focused predominantly for, again, condominium associations, since that's really here in South Florida, the ones that use cooling towers. You want to kind of become familiar with the process of preparation and kind of some of the pitfalls, things to be aware of, things that through my experiences were that have been issues. So a little more formally, we're going to talk about what is a cooling tower, talk very briefly about what the various types of cooling towers out there and what we predominantly see in the condominium marketplace. Some questions about why do we need to replace the cooling tower, the process of it, and then game day, what happens when we actually get out there and replace it. Because again, these are very large pieces of equipment. And it's very interesting to watch them being changed out. And then we're going to wrap up our presentation with some things to think about. What do we need to do? Not a lot with what cooling tower is right, because a lot of times site conditions tie us for things. But more importantly, we'll get more deeper into this in the presentation. But how are we supporting the cooling towers with some code changes? Recently, we really have to uh, really beef up the structure a lot of times from existing. And another big question is, how long we're going to have to be down without cooling, and how to come up with some tricks to uh, minimize that time frame to the smallest amount possible. So for the first question, what is a cooling tower? It's down here in predominant use in South Florida is we tie these to heat pumps, but they can be tied to any system that needs heat rejected from it through a water means. So whatever the equipment is that needs heat rejected, for example, a heat pump, will have water circulating through it, and that water will then take the heat to the cooling tower, where the hot water will come into the tower, and depending upon the tower, will drop through and through the evaporative process will cool the water and send it back out into the system. And so again, evaporation is the key process here. Um, Out west, I used to live in Idaho. We had something called evaporative or swamp coolers, we called them. Some of you may be familiar with those. We actually had those on various office structures where we kind of eliminated the heat pump, and through the evaporative process, we were able to actually cool air down to significant temperatures. Unfortunately, here in South Florida and even in northern Florida, our humidity is way too high for us to be able to use a swamp cooler directly the way we do in Idaho, where the humidity is much lower. But it works on the same basic concept. We drop water in, we allow the water to evaporate, and that evaporation process takes the heat away and carries it out into the environment through airflow through the tower. There's a number of different types of towers that are out there. We have the open cooling tower, which is what is used with the vast majority of condominiums out there. Um, there are a couple of different types of open towers. We have cross flow and counterflow, which means the way the airflow versus the way the water flows in the tower. The air flows across the water flow, and in another tower, in the counter tower, it actually flows counter to the water flow. Um, it's well beyond the scope of this seminar to discuss the pros and cons of either. Uh, Short of it's worth a discussion if especially if you're changing from a cross flow to a counterflow or counterflow to cross flow, it's worth having the discussion and knowing to raise that question with your designer to make sure that if they're changing the type of tower, that they look at various things. For example, one of the things we have to look at is water, especially right on the coast. The water carryover can be an issue with certain types of towers that we need to take a look at. A couple other towers that you'll hear out there is a closed cooling tower, which the water in the system actually is not exposed. Rarely see those in condominiums. See those a lot more on commercial processing, manufacturing type processes, but have seen one or two for reasons I don't entirely understand on condominiums here in South Florida. And then there are others that are the final type is a hybrid cooling tower that kind of combines the best of both worlds, open and closed systems. But again, don't really see those a lot here in South Florida. But know that they're out there, and if your engineer proposes using one of those, might be some questions as to why are you using that type of tower. So the biggest question of all, why replace the cooling tower? Um, the older towers, there's a couple of things. One, some of the larger towers can be rebuilt in place. Some of the very, very large towers, um, sometimes the only option that we do have is uh, basically rebuilding in place. That is a very, very lengthy process typically, and usually you're without um, sections of the tower. So it's, days like today, we're going to do those times over the summer. Those are going to be winter jobs that we do. But generally for towers that we see here on condominiums, it makes a lot more sense to just pull them off and replace them wholesale after they get to a certain age and, increased maintenance cost. You're working on that tower all of the time. Um, One of the things that is kind of covered under maintenance cost is reliability. One of the things that I found with mechanical equipment, I used to drive an old Jeep, but I had another vehicle to back it up, and it was always exciting every morning when I would come out to know whether or not my Jeep was going to start or was actually going to drive. But I knew that I had a lot of maintenance and upkeep, but I had a backup. Typically, with a cooling tower, you're not going to have a backup. So as the maintenance costs go up, that means that the likelihood of a catastrophic sudden failure rises. Um, and so you really want to stay ahead of the curve so you're not losing air conditioning. One of the things we'll talk about more and more in this presentation is the length of time it takes. A cooling tower, dealing with some of the other slides, but a cooling tower is something that's going to be manufactured almost specifically for your building. So it's not something you're going to be able to order and have here next week. So if you have a catastrophic failure, you're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops finding temporary towers out there and everything else. So that's a consideration. If you're starting to see failures and it's at that age, start thinking about replacement. And finally, on this slide, they talk about environmental considerations. Um, what I have found more so on environmental considerations is not replacement of the cooling towers, but again, here in South Florida, for certain buildings that were built in the 50s and 60s, and even up into the 70s, where the environmental concerns were not as big, where they would allow us to take water either from a well or from the intercoastal or from literally even the ocean at times and dump that water back in. Well, as those systems are failing, regulations are prohibiting us from rebuilding those, and the only replacement is to install a cooling tower. So while it's not a replacement for a cooling tower, it's installation for cooling tower. And if you find yourself in that position, and when I give this presentation, I find that there's usually one or two folks that are there that are listening to this presentation that say, "Hey, we've got a well system, or something along those lines, or something we're pulling water out of the intercoastal, and we know that that system's getting ready to fail, especially the wells when the well fails, and so we're looking at putting in a cooling tower." The process is basically the same that you're going to follow. And so, what are the steps that you need to follow? Our recommendation is that you start with a feasibility study and report. Look at what's there existing, um, being able to document it and move on. Then go to construction documents, because again, this is something that's going to need to be permitted, and the various municipalities and authorities having jurisdiction are going to require signed and sealed drawings. So that you definitely need to engage an engineer. Then contractor selection, and a lot of negotiations going on back and forth with that, making sure that everything's covered. And then finally, construction administration and observation, or in other words, game day and the fun. So going into more detail, so feasibility study and report. A lot of people think, I just need the thing replaced. I don't need a study for what's there and what's going. It's a 120 ton tower, cross flow, Marley. Let's just redo that and put it in. Well, as I've said, code changes through the years. If your cooling tower is even 10 years old, the wind loading that it requires is significantly higher. And because the wind loading is significantly higher, the weight of the equipment is significantly higher. And when the weight of the equipment is significantly higher, your existing structure needs to be thoroughly evaluated to make sure that it actually can withstand the weight that the new tower takes in. Um, Plus, I know that it's maybe hard to believe, but occasionally, especially for a condominium built in the 1960s, units are added. And now, when the original needed a 120 ton unit, now we're looking at 140 ton because we've created additional space in a conference room or something along those lines for various reasons, or we took out air cooled units and put them on the water, and no one really took that into consideration. And so that's why, again, the feasibility study is good, is because we'll go onto the site, we'll document everything that's there. We'll come back into the office. We'll do some calculations to make sure as to if the existing tower is what's needed, or if we need to upgrade it. And then the very important part is we'll review the steel and concrete structure to see, is it going to be a minor upgrade? Because the buildings that were designed in the 1960s, it wasn't abnormal that their safety factors were significantly higher than what we use today, because we know today that we have computer technologies that their calculations and finer, so maybe it's okay, or maybe we need to do massive reinforcements of the steel and concrete. And a feasibility report will be able to get you to understand that, versus if you were to go, because one of the things I have, well, why don't I just hire a contractor? And the contractor can just come in and replace what's there. Yes, you can, but most contractors, especially the good ones, they're going to one, the good ones are going to recommend you engage an engineer to be able to do the design, um, because of exact things like this, that there's things that they don't have the staff to be able to evaluate and determine, hey, does the steel need to be upgraded? What needs to be done to upgrade the steel? That's not their position. Their position is to take it off and put back on what has been selected. So again, that feasibility report it's a detailed assessment, along with recommendations. We're going to recommend, this is the equipment that we recommend, this size, and depending, that report may include things such as delivery dates if it's an abnormal, if it's for one reason, it's something that's going to take a longer delivery time, that kind of stuff. Then that'll be included in the report. So then after we have the report and the association understands what needs to be done, then we're going to move to construction documents. And see, I have two slides I have a slide that's out of place, so my apology for that. We'll finish the slide and then kind of go backwards a little bit. Um, but again, to do the permitting, you're going to require a full set of plans, mechanical, electrical, and again, if there's structural that most likely will need to be done, there will also have to be structural drawings and calculations to show that the existing structure can be, what needs to be done to beef it up. And then as part of this process, we will also um, in the next step, work with the selected contractor to pull permits and see what the city review comments are and respond to them. So going backwards a little bit, as part of the assessment, again, these buildings that were built even up into the 90s um, were built in what's known as an open loop system. And so the slide that's up is kind of a schematic drawing of what an open loop system is versus a closed loop. So another thing that a cooling tower does is it is an amazing air filter. So as that water is evaporated, all the crap in the air, whether it's salt if you're on the ocean, or if you're more inland, pine needles, that kind of stuff, anything that's up in the air, it's going to suck in and it's going to push through your piping system in an open loop system. And so all of your individual units, your main rooftop unit on the roof, all of the units down through the floors, are all going to have water that's not necessarily in the best of condition or has to be very aggressively treated. And so during the assessment time and assessment phase is a good time to think about whether or not it makes sense to convert your building to a closed loop. Uh, buildings that are under construction today that have a cooling tower utilize this closed loop system. So we have a heat exchanger that stands between all of the equipment and the tower itself. So that way, all of the dirty water, if you will, that stays between the tower and the heat exchanger. And typically what we utilize is what's known as a plate and frame heat exchanger. So this came about again in the 90s. Prior to this, we used what was known as a shell and tube, and the plate and frame heat exchangers were used for uh, the biggest thing they were used for in the 70s and 80s was beverage manufacturing, and this is something I've always thought is kind of a joke. I swear there was a mechanical engineer walking through a brewery on a tour and saw them utilizing that and went, "Hey, that would work great in an HVAC application, and I'm going to adapt that." Because again, the system, we can take these things apart, they're thin plates, we can clean them out. It's a real easy thing to do and bolt them back together versus a shell and tube where we've got to punch tubes and maybe the tube won't clean out and we have to abandon the tube and plug it. And it was a lot more difficult, which is why we didn't see them a lot prior to the 90s. And the other thing that's happened modernly, uh, manufacturers out there love something called microchannels. So on the water side, it's exactly as it sounds. They're tiny little channels. Well, when you have water that's not as clean as it possibly could be, it can plug those microchannels and impact the performance. As a matter of fact, certain manufacturers, Aon is one that I'm aware of, actually specifically is buried in their literature that says, do not use our rooftop, this particular model, make and model, on an open tower because it will plug up our microchannels. And so that's a separate presentation from this when you're doing rooftop units and things to consider. But obviously then the question is, well, duh, this seems like a no-brainer. Why would I not, when I have the opportunity, go to a heat exchanger? And a lot of times it's because the cost of making that conversion just simply isn't worth it or even possible. And what doesn't show on here is that there's an additional set of pumps that have to be installed. And a lot of times those are 40 and 50 horsepower pumps that are a couple thousand pounds a piece. So typically, again, your cooling tower and heat exchangers are on the roof. So I've got to find a place that I can put another set of pumps, and then when I do that, a lot of times the heat exchangers, it's not abnormal if I have a 100-ton tower that my heat exchanger is going to be 9 to 10,000 pounds. And it's all going to be in a pretty compact footprint. So a lot of times on these older buildings, the structure of the building just simply can't take the weight of a heat exchanger. And there's no way to economically upgrade. But again, it's something worth looking at during that assessment to say, hey, it's a better system. It allows for more energy efficiency. It allows for us to use better equipment on the water side. Is it something we can do? And I have converted a handful of them, but it's definitely something that should be looked at during the assessment process. So now we're at the point we've assessed what our options are. We've looked, we've made the decision that yeah, it's getting near the point where I don't want to be July 5th and get a phone call from my unit owners that the cooling tower's gone down and it's gone down for good. So now we've made the decision to replace it. We've engaged an engineer. We've gone through the assessment process. We've looked at our various and sundry options that we have, made decisions in coordination with our engineer. We've put together a set of specs and plans, and we're ready to go out. So the next step is just that. We go out for bidding and contractor selection. This is an area, again, where we have to be careful with who we pick. There's a lot of great contractors out there, but just as you wouldn't want to uh, for example, I have a great podiatrist, a surgeon. As great as she is, I would not go to her uh, to have my hip replaced. Same with mechanical contractors. You're probably going to have maintenance contractors on your job or on your properties that are doing a fantastic job of maintaining and servicing your equipment, but they may or may not be able to perform everything that's necessary. Um, this is going to be a very complicated process, especially in the high rise condominium marketplace. There's so many things that you have to be taken into account. And again, it's not just as easy as swapping out a unit. We go to the local wholesaler, grab a unit, come back and replace it, and in a day or two we're done. There's a lot that has to be taken into consideration. So you really need to make sure that your bidders list are made up of qualified bidders, that ones that have done this job in the past, have the resources, have the back office support, understand things. For example, in Miami, certain areas in Miami, we can't get a crane in. We have to do a helicopter lift because there's nowhere to place a crane, and everything that's involved in that. We have to have everybody from the FAA to the Coast Guard to local government involved and getting us to get all of the clearances that we need to be able to do those lifts. really cool to watch, especially as a more as an observer than actually having to uh, participate in them. And I say that from experience. I've been on both sides. I've watched and I've also been the one helping hook up cables and get this stuff done. So more so than any other a lot of other, very similar to your concrete restoration, you want to make sure that you have highly qualified bidders to select from. And this is also where I see a lot of associations kind of fall down on the job. You go out, get five bids, you got one that's great, and you're like, okay, hey, let's go with them, and we move on. And then we get into, the next step, construction administration, and we find, oh, well, the contractor didn't include this. So what we recommend is, after you get all of the bids in, that you can narrow it down because there are going to be certain ones that are either way out of the budgetary pricing. They're going to be two and three times what everybody else is in the pack. And you're going to have others that, even with all of the pre-qualifications that you do, are simply going to come across in their bid as probably not being the best qualified. So you narrow it down to a handful of them. And with that handful, then you do a um, bid review and scope review and go through and make sure that you have a full understanding of what's included, what's excluded, and making sure that if the contractor excludes something, that the association is able to figure out a way to make sure that if it's necessary, that it actually happens. And so then finally, after you have all of that, you're able to give those contractors, let them go back. If there's something they took an exception to that's mandatory, maybe they'll add money into their bid for that. Or if there's something where they can, this is also the stage where we're working with contractors. They will occasionally give us value engineering ideas. And on occasion, that they are things that even as deep as we have through the process, don't think about. For example, I had one job where a particular contractor came up with a very creative way of staging, and we were able to uh, actually be only without cooling for a very short period of time, based on the creative way that they came up with um, doing the actual construction. So that was why the association selected them to be able to move forward. But those are the things that are the bid interviews and bid processes. It's not something that you want to go, oh, this is my low bid, let's go with them. You really need to flush out those low bids to make sure, or responsive bids to make sure that everything's covered and that you're getting what's going to be needed to have a successful project. Then comes the fun. So now you've decided you need to have a cooling tower replaced, or you decided that you need to replace your well. You've gone through the assessment, you have the plans and specs, you've got it out for bid, and now you've selected a contractor. So again, preparation and planning is critical for this project. Any construction project requires planning and coordination. But the cooling towers and rooftop unit replacements are probably two that need the most coordination and planning, especially here in South Florida, because when those go down, even if it's just to take them off to replace them, typically the building will not have cooling, at least for a short period of time. Again, as part of the assessment and communication, um, that's one of the things that we need to talk to the contractor about as well. During the planning process, um, do we need to bring in temporary cooling towers? And we had a project in Fort Lauderdale we were involved with. Again, it was an unexpected plan. We ended up having a cooling tower setting in the parking lot for the association for about 7 months, until we could get the new tower installed and everything taken care of. So that's one way of doing it, but it again requires a lot of planning. Where do I put that temporary tower? You don't necessarily want to put it on the roof because of the expense and um, the time that it takes. On the other hand, I had a property that there simply was nowhere on the ground to do it, and we were able to figure out that the stair um, the stair above the stairs will actually support the temporary towers. And so we're able to put the temporary towers up on top of the stairs, um, up on the roof. So yeah, but again, that's part of the planning process. And when you get with that selected contractor, to make sure that that detailed schedule is going to happen. Um, so again, the pre-mobilization preparations are critical. Um, we want to make sure that they have everything in place so when the time comes to pull the trigger, it flows smoothly. And so, again, pre-mobilization, you need to have site access plans. Are we going to be able to set a crane somewhere? Do I have to make some kind of an agreement because we don't have any ability to set a crane here, but our association next door, might be willing to let us use a small part of their property to lift, or we can't put a crane anywhere. We're going to have to lift from a helicopter. Okay, well, where do we stage our equipment? Do we have to put it on a barge out in the ocean and fly it in? Can we stage it at a, rent part of a park down the street and stage it there and take it out? So those are all things that need to be pre-planned before the day of. Um, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to go to a supply house and buy this cooling tower. These are typically multi-week, 12, 14-week delivery items, depending upon the size. Smaller ones we can get a little faster, but bigger towers and the more specialties that they have, even the longer that it takes. And you're not going to be able to order it until the contractor is selected and you're able to get submittals from the contractor's vendors to be able to review to understand what they're putting in. And so again, if you take nothing else away from this webinar, understand that this is not a quick, short process. Again, this is not like replacing a single air conditioning unit. There's a lot of planning that goes into this to make sure that it goes off smooth. And again, communication, I think I think someone told me it was George Bernard Shaw that said that, the problem with communication is the illusion that it's actually happening. And so, you need to make sure that you're pre-planning that we are actually communicating and that everybody's on the same page. And so with that, again, coordination. Typically, your facility operation team is going to be involved from the start of the feasibility state studies, you know, and they will have been kept up to date. Again, you really should do that. Your building engineer should be involved in the process from day one to understand, because if nothing else, they know the building and then they also have to live with it after all the rest of us are gone. So, it's important for them to have their input and also to provide the knowledge that they have. So that person is a very important part of the team. And the same with the property manager. A lot of property managers know their buildings very well also. And the other key with the property manager we'll talk about is how the property manager knows unit owners. And I will get to that. Um, all the contractors and subcontractors, and I would add into there also the engineer need to be ensured that we all have clear timelines of what needs to be done. Again, this is typically something that as an engineer, um, I have someone available on the week that we're going to do the lift, that we're actually going to shut the equipment down, take the old equipment off, put the new equipment on. I try to make sure that I have someone available, and if I don't have someone available, I'll make myself available to, if not be on site, at least be on standby to be able to pick up the phone and say, oh, hey, we lifted this tower up and this is the issue that we came into. And so having that timeline and responsibility to make sure everybody knows what they need to do is critical. Again, we're going to coordinate with local authorities having jurisdiction, everything from the permit and getting the plans reviewed and submitted to dealing with street shutdowns, the other regulatory agencies in Miami and Miami-Dade and Broward County. Durham has a lot more to do. The Department of Environmental Regulation and Management, I believe, is what it's called. The environmental group in the government has a lot more to say with cooling towers. Here where I'm located in Palm Beach and north where we do a fair amount of work in Martin County, they're not as involved and not as concerned, but they still will want to look at the and being part of the process. And then most importantly, communication and coordination with board members and unit owners. Um, while a cooling tower replacement is not going to be nearly as disruptive as a concrete restoration project, it's still going to be disruptive, especially if the association makes the decision that they can live without cooling for 2 days, which some associations decide to do because renting temporary equipment is very expensive and there's a lot that goes into it. Um, then unit owners have to be able to understand that. Another approach that I've seen when we're replacing cooling towers, we'll have the contractor go rent air conditioning equipment and put a standalone air conditioning unit, self-contained air conditioning unit in every unit. For a smaller building where we have 24, 30 units, that might be feasible. For a larger, 35 story where we have 200 units, that's probably not going to make sense. We're probably going to want to lean more towards doing a temporary tower if we're going to have to be down for days. But again, it goes back to planning with the contractor and getting the right contractor and making sure. But unit owners at some point will see, um, even from the simple standpoint of now we're done, now we got to start all the units up. And you will have to go to each individual unit at startup to help make sure that it starts up correctly and gets air out of the system and everything else. So again, a lot of coordination, a lot of people, a lot of moving wheels, a lot of planning that needs to take place. Now for what I would, again, like I said, game day. Um, Typically the time that we shut the cooling tower down, take it off the roof and put it up, that process actually usually is very fast. Um, Rarely have I seen that process take more than a week. Usually, at most, a day or two of lifting the equipment off and putting it back on. And quite frankly, a lot of times, we want to focus on one single day to get the equipment off and back. Now, that doesn't mean the equipment's only down one day because we got a lot of piping we got to take off. We got to get the area prepped. And so it may be that, we shut the unit down on one day. We lift in on day two, and then on day three, we're getting stuff back up so we can at least get the tower temporarily back up and running and get water to the building. And that's a best case. That is, I mean, that's your goal to be able to aim to do something like that. Um, but again, a lot of the planning and stuff required to get to that point. So what happens on game day? A small army will probably descend on your property, even if it's a smaller building. There's a lot of people that are involved in getting the building lift done and equipment off. You can see from the pictures here, all the equipment. We got a couple of different cranes that have come in. We have the equipment sitting on another semi truck. And this particular one, we were also replacing some pumps, you see again, those pumps are a couple thousand pounds. We're going to have a tough time getting those up to the roof if you don't have elevator access. So we want to lift those on the same day and get those in place. So again, all the material, we want to make sure that all the material is there on site on game day so that we're not having to run to the supply store to find anything. Um, and again, making sure that all of the planning has been done so that we can execute the plan. And I think it's, as Mike Tyson said, though, every good fight plan is a good fight plan until the first punch lands. Construction is very similar. Everything's a great plan. So again, planning contingencies as well. I've said just the other day, talking to a group similar to this, I've been in construction almost 4 decades now, and in that time frame, I can think of one project where a little different application. I opened up a wall, and it was like, wow, that's perfect. That's not what I anticipated, but it's exactly what I needed. Usually, we open up stuff and go, oh. We had no way of knowing that until we started into it and started tearing things apart. That's not good. How are we going to address that? Now, fortunately, again, going back with engineering staff that have experience and understand this, going with contractors that have years of experience doing this and understand. We have seen um, even if we can't see it, we know a lot of the oopses that happen on game day that we need to be prepared for. Not to say that we're not sometimes still surprised, because even after 4 decades, I still see some things new at times. But again, having those key people that have that experience will help the process go as smooth as possible. And then the easy part, clean up. You still have to get everything, just like any construction project. You typically have a lot of debris and stuff left on the roofs, and getting rid of it needs to be part of the plan. So, kind of wrapping things up here to hopefully have a few minutes left for presentations. Um, a couple things or three things to think about. What cooling tower is right for me. Again, of the three, I think that's probably the least important, but it's still a good um, question to have with your engineer. The bigger part of that, as far as the tower, if you have an open loop currently, does it make economic sense for us to do the work that we need to do to switch to a closed loop? That's probably the biggest decision at that point. If you already have a closed loop system, then it's obviously much easier. And some of it as well want to go, what tower is right for me? You also need to make decisions at this point in time. Do I need to replace the pumps? It's always, my recommendation that if the pumps are the same age as the tower, probably a good time. We're doing the work. Last thing you want to have happen is you had a new cooling tower, and 6 months later, your old pump failed. And as a board member, now you have to go to, or a property manager, you have to go to unit owners and explain. And it's usually the most cost-effective time to do it, but it's still a consideration. I've replaced towers without replacing pumps because the pumps are relatively new because they had to replace them. So again, that's a question. What is the not just what tower is right for me, but what is the overall scope of my project? The next one, what is the tower supported on? This is the one that I've seen we really get hit on. Again, I can't almost, a rooftop unit, air conditioner, I can play with um, stuff that's inside of it. I can split systems up. I can shift the weight around. I can get pretty creative with rooftop units to distribute the weight and do okay with the structural and not deal a lot with the structural stuff. Cooling towers, I simply don't have that option. And again, as I've said, with code changes, the wind loading is significantly higher. They got to be beefier structures. They weigh a lot more. The forces that they have to withstand are a lot more. And again, if I'm replacing a tower that's 20, 30 years old, um, I'm not going to, even if I replace with an identical tower, the weight is going to be enough that I have to address the structural in one form or another. But again, going back to that assessment, that's why that assessment is key, from that assessment, I will then be able to know, do I just have to make some slight modifications to it, or am I looking at a major structural upgrade that I'm going to need to do to be able to support the tower? So again, a lot of answers come out of the assessment. And then, how long am I going to be without cooling? We've talked about that a couple times. Again, temporary towers are very expensive, but we can do them. It does have a lot to do with budget. On the other hand, you don't here in South Florida, especially, you don't want to let a building set even in December and January for weeks and weeks without cooling, or more importantly, dehumidification. And that brings up another, not only how long am I going to be out of cooling? When am I going to be out of cooling? This is typically not a project that you want to schedule and figure that game day is going to be August 1st. This is one that you really more want to be able to have uh, in the wintertime months, if you can plan that. Plus, it also helps, here again in Florida, we're out of hurricane season after late November, and these are great January, February timeframe. But in order to do that, like I said, we have to know, well in advance. It takes a long time for the design, it takes a long time, even longer, to get the material in. So this is definitely something you need to plan out to make sure if you want to look at November. And this is just kind of another viewpoint of just how busy this is going to be. You can see, we have two different lifts. We have a man lift in the background. You can see they've actually lifted the cooling tower off the truck, but we have more equipment in the semi truck in the back. And while this only shows, it looks like two people. There's at least 8 or 9 other people that were around on the job site this day. And so, the day of the lift is just typical of the overall project. So again, if there's one golden nugget that I could get you to take away from the presentation today, it would be replacing a cooling tower is a very involved process that requires a lot of planning and a fair amount of time to make sure that it goes smoothly, and you want to make it go smoothly. So, definitely involve the professionals, get the quality contractors involved, and do the due diligence, do the prior planning, and your cooling tower will go replacement will go smoothly. And so, with that, I think we have a few minutes left for questions. Mario, do we have any questions in the chat?
I think we do have a couple questions. So we have one call said that says clarification, closed loop system does not move dirty water to the first floor? Question mark.
That's correct. It keeps the dirt, the quote unquote dirty water, and it's not really dirty. I mean, it's water that's going to require continuous treatment versus a closed loop system. Once I got the closed loop water treated, then short of a break, I'm not my that water is going to maintain its quality. Versus on the open loop side, again, like I said, a cooling tower is an air filter. It's going to suck up everything in the air, all the impurities, everything in the air is going to get sucked up. So with a closed loop system, which again, if you were building a high-rise condo today, chances are very good that's the system that's going to go in place. It keeps that quote unquote dirty water between the tower and the heat exchanger. So that way I've got a much smaller system, and every bit of that system is readily accessible to actually clean. So that's a long way of saying the answer to this question. Yes, it stops that dirty water from going down to the first floor. But again, like a caveat, it can be very expensive and may not even be economically feasible depending upon the particular building that we're looking at.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to make sure you guys have a chance to grab the evaluation form, which I just put in the chat. If you don't have your chat open, just make sure on the bottom of your screen you'll see your chat button. Go ahead and click that right now. I'll go ahead and put the evaluation form in the chat again. I'll give you guys a little bit to open that up. Make sure it's open, and then I'll put it in again. If it's already open, you should see it now. At the end, I'll give you guys a couple minutes just to ask any questions. Make sure you're able to access that evaluation form. All right. The next question we have is, does the engineer have to provide the detailed specification of the project for contractors to provide bids, or do the contractors make decisions once on the project?
The short answer is yes. Um, typically, the engineer will select the equipment again in coordination with the property, and you know, everybody will bid, and we'll want everybody to bid on that basis. But occasionally, yes, a contractor will come back for various reasons and say, hey, for example, instead of using a Baltimore air coil, such and such, I want to use a, um, why am I not thinking of the other name tower? Marley. I want to use a Marley because Marley is promising me a 22-week lead time versus BAC giving me a 30-week lead time, so we can get it done, and that gets us in the window that we want to. So usually, though, the usual is that the engineer selects and specifies it, and it's usually a lot cleaner for the contractor to use the basis of design and move forward. But every once in a while, the contractor will propose a different manufacturer, a different piece of equipment. And again, when that happens, then we'll look at it. Um, there's a lot of great tower manufacturers out there. BAC and Marley are just two of them that are good. And when that happens, then as the engineer, I would look at what they're proposing to make sure that weight wise, because again, that's critical. So if the Marley's 1,000 pounds more than the BAC, well, that impacts all of my structure, and I got to go back. And yeah, it may be a quicker time or cheaper, but now I've got to spend $10,000 more on my structural design and another 15,000 beefing up the structure. And so, as an engineer, I'm going to look at those that a lot of times the contractors won't look at, um, to make sure that we are getting apples to apples to apples.
All right. What is the standard lifespan of cooling towers?
So if you come to me and you have a cooling tower as part of your reserve study, I'm typically going to put about a 20-year life expectancy on it. Um, However, I have pulled 30-year heat pumps or 30-year cooling towers. And I'm sorry, heat pump just popped up on my screen, so that was what went into my head. I've taken off towers that are 30 years old. On the other hand, I've taken off some that are 10 years old. One of the big things, and again, stay tuned, presentation for another day. Preventative maintenance is really key to maintaining and extending the life of your equipment. So if you're doing things like replacing the fills periodically, keeping, making sure that your water going into it is of high quality, you're doing, that kind of high-end preventative maintenance, the tower is going to tend to last a little bit longer. But I would plan right around that 20-year time frame.
Okay, and then I think we just have one more question, which is the HP noted on the slide is the heat pump. Do all cooling tower systems have a HP? If so, is that typically replaced when the tower is done?
So the heat pump could be literally, you have 200 units. It could be the 200 heat pumps in the individual units or the individual rooftops. Now, if you're asking about the heat pumps that are the rooftops that are supplying outside air, especially if you're one of those buildings that I have to do a helicopter lift, I would strongly consider and recommend looking at replacing both of them at the same time. Um, for example, a helicopter lift. We're doing a project right now in Aventura. Um, the helicopter lift alone is about 200,000. Just for the lift, just for the helicopter. And that helicopter lift doesn't care if I'm lifting one tower, three towers, 6 rooftop units, 1 rooftop unit. It doesn't, whatever they can get done in a day, that's what they're going to lift. So if you especially if you're in one of those situations where I can't set a crane, I would definitely think about replacing your rooftop units that are typically heat pumps at the same time frame. Handful of properties out there have what's known as a chiller, where that's usually in a central location and chilled water gets sent out, but that's typically more of a commercial type of a building that many, not many, very, very few of the condominiums down here have that type of system. And if you do, that's again a much deeper topic than a quick answer here for that. So if that's the situation, reach out to me. I'm glad to have a conversation.
Thanks, David. We appreciate that. And then we do have one last question that came in. Do you recommend professionals to maintain versus building maintenance person?
So a lot of this is a business decision. And one of the things, my background again coming from a mechanical contractor, um, I joke around, I didn't come to the dark side here into the engineering world until I moved to Florida. I've been an engineer for decades, but I worked for mechanical contractors. I ran service divisions. It really depends. Um, for most condominiums, it probably makes more sense to have a professional maintain it, because quite frankly, they can do it more cost effectively. And to find that very unique person that is very skilled in maintaining all of the equipment that you have is probably going to be cost prohibitive in the salary range for most people. Um, the biggest thing though that I recommend is making sure that whether you have it done by a professional or in-house staff, and typically it's probably really a blend of both, but the importance of a preventative maintenance plan. You really need to have a plan in place that every week it says, hey, this is weekly stuff I need to do. Every month this is filter stuff that I need to do. Once a quarter I need to grease and oil this stuff. Having a plan in place so you can have a checklist that whether it's done by your building maintenance guy or it's one of the professionals coming in, making sure that you have some way of tracking not only what needs to be done, but also that it was actually done, regardless of who did it.
All right, I think that's all of our questions for the moment. If you guys do have additional questions, please follow up with David directly. Thank you for providing your contact information. We appreciate that. I'm gonna put the evaluation form in the chat right now one more time. There we go. I'll hang out for a few minutes just in case anybody has questions about that evaluation form. Otherwise, one more question. Right at the finish line, our condo has AC air handlers in each unit. I assume these are HPs, correct?
The typical design down here in Florida, again, all of Florida, Orlando, even Jacksonville, for condominiums, typically a heat pump. So again, we need air conditioning more than we need heat. So it's typically going to be a heat pump that, again, typically will also have some heat capacity as well. So if you're listening in Jacksonville, that cooling tower, that's a whole nother thing to talk to your engineer about as far as design and how in the cold months to make sure that we're not getting that down. I didn't really talk about that during design. But yeah, typically that's the response, or typically that's the equipment that we see down here are individual heat pumps in the individual units.
Lovely. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you to David for a wonderful presentation. We have a lot of thank yous and a lot of great feedback. So we appreciate it. Very interesting information. And again, feel free to reach out to David directly for any additional questions, or to request the slides. Slide distribution is up to each presenter if they'd like to share them. So that's up to David. If you'd like to share
It's funny.
them, it's amazing. We will record this webinar is recorded. We will post it on acebytsk.com within a few days. So you can find it, share it, all that good stuff. If you guys have additional questions, I'm going to hang out for a couple of minutes. You can put them in the chat. Otherwise, we hope to see you next Wednesday for legal update.
Awesome. All right. Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
David. We'll see you
Appreciate it
soon.
today.
We appreciate it. Take care.